Welcome back, brothers, to Hammer Lore. Tonight we're covering the entire lore behind the Raptor Marines. Before we get into the video, be sure to like and comment any topics and videos you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. Last but not least, be sure to check out the merch in the description below. And I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it like usual. Now, let's get into the video.
They lie in the dirt, and they pretend to be dead. The jungle has been burning for so long that the ash falls like grey snow, drifting down in slow, choking sheets. It settles on shattered hab walls, and on the rusted ribs of promethium silos, on the bare branches of trees that never knew this much smoke, and on the heavy, motionless shapes of 10 armored giants half buried in the loam. From a distance, they could be wreckage, hulks abandoned in some older war, left to sink back into the soil of a world that is already more grave than planet. Their armor is the color of rotted leaves and old brass, mottled in broken patterns that make the outline of each warrior dissolve into the craters and tree stumps around him. Cloaks of camellia-line mesh are drawn over shoulders and helmets, pinned down with splinters of bark and clumps of charcoal. The twin-headed eagle on their chests is dulled and scarred, scraped almost smooth in places, smothered in paint or netting in others. They do not move. They barely seem to breathe. Vines clutch at greaves and elbow plates. Ash gathers in the joints of gauntlets. Insects scuttle across visors that reflect nothing but the smoke-dimmed light of a cold sun somewhere above the canopy. This is what the warriors of the Adeptus Astartes look like when they abandon the theater of war and accept that their purpose is not to be seen, only to kill. Down the jungle road that once was a proper avenue of transit, Xenos armor growls and hums and clicks its way into the kill zone. Tau skimmers float above the cracked plasteel, anti-grav engines whining like teeth ground together in the throat of a dying god. Drones drift overhead in slow, lazy lattices, sensor arrays twitching. Human auxiliaries tramp in the dust at the column's edges, heads bowed beneath rebreathers, rifles slung with the defeated slouch of men who know they are garrison stock for an empire that does not even pretend to love them. Inside the helmets buried in the dirt, green runes glow. Targeting reticles creep across display fields. Range data, wind estimates, focal adjustments. Faint vox glyphs blink acknowledgement as firing orders pass from mind to mind without a single spoken word. The Raptors are awake. They are a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, born from shadow and from loss, a successor to the Raven Guard created in the Second Founding, when the broken legions were cut down into chapters and thrown out into a galaxy that was still screaming from the wounds of the heresy. Their gene seed is Corax's, their birthright the same as the black-armored ghosts who prefer to strike from the dark and fade before the enemy can strike back. But where the Raven Guard still remember what it meant to stand at the side of a Primarch who had known a better age, the Raptors were born in the long, grim aftermath. They did not march at the Great Crusade's height. They opened their eyes in the stalking years of the Scouring, when the traitor legions were being hunted across stars that would never forget the taste of burning worlds. They were shaped not by tales of glory, but by tallies of what had been lost. From the start, they leaned into the only thing that seemed to matter anymore. Not honor, not pageantry, efficiency. Their armor is practical, their livery a muted green that takes to dirt and ash like a natural camouflage rather than the heraldic splendor of other chapters. Their iconography is restrained, badges small and subdued, purity seals pinned flat, company markings tucked away where they are more useful as identification than as a banner. They operate from fleets rather than some mountain-sized fortress, striking from strike cruisers and battle barges that can vanish into the void as easily as a sniper melts into underbrush. They prize the long shot, the clean kill, the campaign whose story can be told in a few lines of after-action report instead of a dozen weighty tomes. There are chapters in the Imperium who stride into battle like knights from fever dreams, cloaked in parchments and crowned in halos of artificed light, their colors bright and defiant, even in the smoke of extermination. There are chapters who roar litanies of hate as they charge, who announce their every step with vox-amplified oaths and the thunder of chain blades. They believe, with a fervor that might almost be noble, that faith and courage and glorious slaughter are arguments the universe can hear. The Raptors look at them and see a liability. Where others advance in shining ranks across open killing fields, the Raptors infiltrate. Where others raise banners, they cut vox traffic. Where others sound the assault, they let silence do the talking. They are the answer the Imperium gave to a question that should have made it uncomfortable. What happens if you take the gene-forged perfection of a space marine and strip away the need to be seen? What if you ask not? What does honor demand? But what will make the enemy? Die and keep our own alive for as many wars as possible? They are the practical horror of the post-heresy age made manifest. They are what happens when a warrior culture built on myth is forced by casualty reports and lost sectors to accept that victory matters more than whether the corpses are arranged in a pleasing pattern for the remembrances. The sergeant, lying half under the remnant of a civilian hauler, shifts his aim a fraction of a degree. His breath rasps once, deliberately, through filters clogged with ash. The target rune over the Xenos command vehicle brightens. Vox clicks, the barest of sounds, move through the squad as confirmations. They will kill the ethereal first, then the fireblades, then any marker-light operators. After that, whatever is left will be nothing but animals suddenly freed of their leash. The Raptors are elite Xenos hunters, not because of some ceremonial oath carved into the walls of a grand hall, but because their way of war is perfectly suited to the enemies that have risen from the galactic dark in this age, orc empires that spread like rot and feed on the spectacle of frontal assault. Eldari corsairs who trust in speed and arrogance and the certainty that the lesser species will never quite understand their paths. The methodical, data-obsessed expansion of the Tau Empire, that civilization of calm-voiced conquerors who built an entire ideology atop the deception that there is such a thing as a clean war. Orcs can be bled, Eldari can be misled, Tau can have their elegant lines of logic shattered by a shot they could not predict. The Raptors excel at all of this. Their patience threads itself into months-long sabotage campaigns against orc warlords, strangling supply chains and breaking the linchpin of a war with surgical strikes instead of glorious last stands. They learn the rhythms of Corsair raids, map the weak points in webway incursions, and wait at the exact breach where the arrogant alien captain expects. Another easy harvest, only to find a bolt round waiting. Against the Tau, they turn the enemy's obsession with information against them, feeding false readings into sensor nets, sniping out pathfinders and cadre leaders, forcing battlesuits to advance blind into carefully sown minefields. Their history is a string of these quiet atrocities, each one another proof that the galaxy does not care how pretty the corpse piles look, as long as someone survives on the other side to raise a flag over them. On Sancta Angelus, they fought orcs in a theater of endless greenskin war, locked away from Imperial reinforcement by snarling warp storms for year after starving year. Entire companies broke down into wandering kill teams that moved from world to world, never staying long enough to be encircled, always cutting where the orcs were fattest and least wary. When they finally reached the war boss and his armored bodyguard, it was not at the head of a glorious charge, but at the end of a slow, grinding constriction that left the Xenos Empire tearing itself apart in their wake. On Endicon, they served as liberators and executioners both, picking through the bones of a hive world that had labored under Eldari raiders, pulling Corsair princes out of their stolen palaces with precise shots and sudden raids while the human population tried to remember whether rescue and conquest truly felt so different on the receiving end. On Taros, they bled for a campaign that spiraled into failure, holding rear guards under punishing Tau fire so that guard regiments and fellow Astartes could extract, learning bitter lessons about just how much punishment a Xenos empire built on range and precision can dish out. On the scorched plains of the Third War for Armageddon, they acted as hunters amidst industrial hell, stalking orc warbands through smog and furnace exhaust, using every inch of hive geometry as a weapon. During the vast thrust of the Indomitus Crusade, they were scattered like shards of flint ahead of the main Imperial spearheads, tasked with hunting corsair fleets in the half-lit void near the Great Rift's ravening edge, doing what they had always done, pulling out the enemy's eyes and ears long before anyone else arrived to plant banners. Threaded through all of this blood and ash is a single, unassuming figure. Lias Issodon, the Grim, does not look like the vision of a chapter master that poets love. He does not stride into halls to the crash of litanies, does not seek the center of the line merely to be seen. His armor is as battered and unadorned as any veteran's. His helm is as likely to be covered in a camo cloak as held in the crook of an elbow for effect. There are no great golden wreaths carved around his name. What there is a reputation. A marksman without flourish who is said to be able to draw a line between muzzle and skull across distances that make lesser warriors blink in disbelief. A strategist who thinks in layers of contingency and acceptable losses rather than in simple arrows on a map. A commander who understands that his Marines are not expendable icons, but extremely finite instruments that must be preserved if the long wars against the alien are to continue. Issodon embodies his chapter's creed. Your life is not yours. It belongs to the sum total of campaigns yet to come. Heroism that burns that resource for a single moment of song is treasonous. Heroism that kills the right target and gets you and your squad out alive is the only kind that matters. He will yield overall command in a war if doing so serves the wider purpose, as he did in the Badab conflict, when a more politically acceptable Lord of War was needed to lead, content to have the Raptors act as escort and interdiction specialists against secessionist raiders. He will lie in the dirt beside his men if that is where the best shot will be taken from. He will grind down an enemy over long, miserable months and call that victory, because he does not believe there is such a thing as an easy win in this age. This is not a triumphant saga of noble knights. There will be no elven minstrels singing of the Raptors in crystal spires, no illuminated manuscripts in some sainted shrine that paint them with flawless faces and robes of gold. What follows is closer to a dossier, a long, ugly report on a chapter that treats war like a disease that must be contained or burned out before it spreads. They are the scalpel the Imperium reaches for when the infection is too deep for a hammer blow, and the nightmare that implies for anything not human that finds itself marked for excision. The Raptors do not fight clean wars. They do not believe such things exist. They fight necessary wars. Wars that leave worlds in ruins and populations shattered and whole species limping, blinded, choking on their own blood. They fight them with a meticulous cruelty that is all the more terrifying for how impersonal it is. The story that unfolds from here will move in the same way that they do. From their birth in the aftermath of the Scouring, when the legions were torn apart and remade into chapters that would carry the burden of the Imperium's survival. Through the years, when they were thought dead, their homeworld swallowed and their names struck from the ledgers, even as they persisted in the dark. Through decades of stalking orc empires, gutting Eldari corsair fleets, and learning at painful cost how to bleed the Tau without bleeding themselves dry. And then into the epoch of the Indomitus, when reality itself ruptured and the galaxy became a worse place than even the oldest veterans remembered, and still the Raptors went to war along the edges of the Great Rift, ghosts in the smoke, patient, implacable, unadorned. They lie in the dirt now, on this nameless jungle road. Rifles steady, hearts slow, minds calm. The ethereal on the lead skimmer raises his head, perhaps sensing that something is wrong, perhaps only admiring the ruin around him. It does not matter. The Raptors exist to make sure that for the enemies of mankind, the moment when they understand that something is wrong is also the moment they die. The sky above Deliverance was the color of a dying bruise. Storm fronts crawled across it in slow, ugly bands, dragging rain and industrial ash over the jagged hives and the fortress nests of the Raven Guard. Lightning flickered in the depths of those clouds, searing momentary scars of white that left after-images dancing across the lenses of the armored giants drilling on the basalt parade grounds below. They moved in silence, 100 warriors in black plate, each one a son of Corax, each one scarred in ways the flesh did not always show. Their armor still bore the stains of the war that had shattered the age of Crusade. Some plates were new, smooth and matte, fresh from forges that had barely survived the fires of the heresy. Others were patched with metal from a dozen, different manufactoria, each layer a relic of another campaign, another evacuation, another last stand bought with blood. This was no full company in the proud legion sense. The Raven Guard had been bled too hard for that. This was a cadre, a training formation in name, a knot of survivors in truth. They were old by Astarte's standards, veterans of the Issodon betrayal and the long, limping retreat that had followed. They had watched their Primarch break himself on impossible tasks and vanish into the dark with the taste of failure thick on his tongue. They had fought in the shadows of a galaxy on fire, harrying traitor columns and striking at supply lines while the broken loyalist forces tried to hold the core. Now, in the echo of that apocalypse, they marched in step on a parade square that had seen too many memorials and not enough victories. Orders had come down from the one being in the Imperium who could still give them with that old certainty. Robout Guilliman, the Lord of Ultramar, had taken up the burden of rebuilding what Horus had broken. His Codex Astartes would break the legions into more manageable, more controllable, chapter-sized forces, each sworn to the High Lords and to the Emperor enthroned in golden agony. The age of the legions was dead. What stood on Deliverance this day was the Raven Guard's attempt to make sure that what replaced it did not forget how to fight in the dark. The marshal overseeing the drill watched his warriors with cold, grey eyes. His armor was a patchwork of campaign scars and hastily re-sanctified plates, the Raven's sigil hanging heavy on one shoulder, dull and unpolished. He had already been told what was coming. The cadre under his command would not be folded back into the restructured Raven Guard chapter. They were being cut loose. Their new designation had a number and a name. The number did not matter. Numbers could be erased in ledgers far from any battlefield. The name did. From the training platforms. Above, from vox speakers mounted in the teeth of carved ravens, the new title rolled out over the drilling warriors. Raptors. There was no cheer, no swell of pride. Corax had left them with little taste for ceremony. Instead, helms turned fractionally, warriors glancing at one another across the ranks, measuring, weighing. A new badge would be painted on their shoulders. A new seal would hang on their banners. The enemies they hunted would die just the same. The Raptors were a shard of the Raven Guard's legion, broken off and sent out into the dark with a single brutal mandate: hunt, pursue, exterminate. In the first years after the heresy, the Imperium could not afford to let its enemies breathe. The traitor legions were in retreat, yes, but their fleets bled poison into every system they touched, leaving cults and corrupted garrisons and hastily raised Xenos allies festering in their wake. The Great Scouring was the name later scribes would give to what followed, as if that word could capture the sheer scale of the killing that had to be done. The Raptors learned what that word truly meant. Their first deployments were not glorious line breaks in the core systems, where other chapters might clash head-on with ragged traitor battle lines under the watchful gaze of Primarchs and Primarchs' sons. The Raptors were sent outward, to the places where the warp storms still snarled, and the astropathic choirs screamed themselves blind, trying to pierce the veil. They went where the traitors ran. On the edge of a nameless frontier world, a stripped-down strike cruiser bearing their new sigil burned hard on minimal emissions, engines throttled just below the point where R-Specs would pick up the flare. Below, a half-crippled warship in the colors of a once loyal legion limped toward a gravity well, its escort a ragged scatter of smaller vessels crewed by mortal traitors and hired alien guns. The Raptors did not announce themselves. They did not open vox hails. Loaded with scripture, they slipped in behind the fleeing formation like a knife between ribs. Boarding torpedoes slammed home, mag clamps tearing through rent armor. In the cramped, bloody corridors of the traitor vessel, the newly named Raptors fought shoulder to shoulder in the way they had always done, bolters roaring, blades hacking, armor plates ringing under desperate blows. The Legion markings on the walls did not matter. Loyalist, traitor. Those words were for scribes and lords. Here, it was simply a question of who still drew breath when the recoil shock faded. On the command deck, surrounded by dead crew and flickering hololiths, a former Legion captain in enemy colors met the gaze of a Raptor sergeant and understood that the age of brother fighting brother was closing. The Scouring was not about argument. It was about subtraction. The Raptors had not come to debate loyalty. They had come to erase. In engagement after engagement across the broken rim of the Imperium, they did the same. They tracked fleeing war bands through half-charted systems, followed the trail of raider attacks and astropathic distress into backwater worlds that never had names, and put an end to them there. There were no chroniclers present, no remembrances composing heroic verse, while bolter shells tore flesh and ferrocrete apart. Afterwards, the Raptors would log the action in terms of tonnage destroyed, enemy gene seed recovered, supply caches captured or burned. Then they would move on. Underlying all of this was the particular flavor of their gene seed, that inheritance of flesh and mind that bound them still to deliverance and to the absent shadow of Corax. Raven Guard, stock-bred stealth into bone, their oolitic kidneys and multi-lung augmetics, their enhanced musculature and nervous systems, all sang most clearly when they were operating apart from support, in environments where endurance and patience mattered more than berserker fury. Their skin took to darkness easily. Their reflexes lent themselves to ambush and sudden, precise violence. Even their metabolism seemed content with long periods of waiting, punctuated by brief, horrific expenditure. The Raptors took that inheritance and sharpened it further. On the drill decks of their newly reassigned ships, recruits and veterans alike trained not for grand charges, but for insertion and withdrawal under no support. They ran live fire simulations with their vox nets jammed, forced to make decisions with incomplete information, knowing that there would be no reinforcement if they misjudged. They were dropped by teleport and by drop pod into barren moons with only the ammunition they could carry and a list of objectives, told simply that extraction would not occur until every target was neutralized. They learned to treat isolation as default, not exception. Being cut off was not a crisis. It was Wednesday. In those early centuries, they had no grand fortress monastery carved into a mountain or grown around some sacred relic world. They were fleet-based, living out of the holds and gun decks of their warships, their chapels and reliquaries bolted into bulkheads and hangar bays. Their home was the void. Their doors opened most often, not to farmland and shrine cities, but to the scorched airlock lips of boarding tubes slamming home against enemy hulls. They specialized in surgical strikes and boarding actions, in void warfare, where a poorly timed burst of gravitic interference or a single lucky macro cannon hit could cut them off from everything except their own determination. They learned to move like ghosts through ship guts, to kill command crews and sabotage drives and munitions, with a surety that left captured vessels drifting dead in the dark, crewed only by cooling corpses and the faint crackle of misfiring Vox relics. Even then, the pattern that would haunt their history was already clear. When a war zone's description included phrases like "no resupply expected" or "warp routes unstable" or "no other Imperial assets in theater," the Raptors' sigil moved up the list of recommendations. They were sent into no-win environments not because their lords wished them harm, but because someone had to go, and the Raptors had already shown that they had an ugly talent for making such places just barely winnable. On a low-gravity mining moon, where cultists loyal to the fallen Warmaster had hired orc warbands as blunt instruments, the Raptors arrived weeks after more parade. Worthy chapters had declined the honor. They found a fortress hollowed out of rock, its choke points seeded with greenskin gun nests, its outer approaches a killing ground of scavenged Imperial weaponry. The local guard had been slaughtered to a man. The Administratum had written the installation off as lost. The Raptors cut their engines outside sensor range, took a week to map every heat source, every patrol route, every fluctuation in power grids. Then they went in small, a few squads at a time, through vents and old excavation shafts. They killed the human overseers first, knowing that without their crude direction, the orcs would begin to fight among themselves. They seeded crude graffiti and stolen trophies through the complex, twisting alien instincts toward paranoia and internal bloodletting. By the time the last Raptor walked out to the extraction shuttle, the fortress was a charnel pit of orc against orc, final detonations bringing the tunnels down over screaming throats and garish armor. To an outside observer, it might almost have looked as if the warband had torn itself apart. Only the meticulous pattern of collapsed corridors and removed ammunition stores betrayed the guiding hand behind the chaos. In the black gulfs between worlds, they hunted minor Eldari raiders who had sold their blades to traitor captains as harassment flotillas. The aliens thought in terms of elegant arcs and sudden, flawless strikes, treating war as a dance. The Raptors answered with ugly, asymmetrical maneuvers and long periods of apparent absence, luring corsair ships closer with feigned damage and then erupting from hiding to board in multiple points at once. They learned quickly that Eldar arrogance was as much a weapon to be turned as any blade. Human and Xenos pirate conglomerates fared no better. These mongrel fleets, stitched together from stolen transports and half-functioning warships, relied on the assumption that Imperial response would be slow, ponderous, encumbered by doctrine and chain of command. The Raptors arrived without fanfare, burned down the flagship, or broke the leadership crew through targeted assassinations, then left the survivors to turn on one another over dwindling plunder. All of this fed into the chapter's evolving relationship with the Codex Astartes. On parchment and in hololithic projection, the Codex was a masterpiece of organization and tactical thought, a distillation of Guilliman's vast experience. The Raptors studied it with the attention they gave any tool that might sharpen their edge. They learned the prescriptions on company structure, on deployment types, on optimal weapon loadouts for theaters of different kinds. But for them, the Codex was never scripture. It was a manual, a starting point. If a given theater demanded that the 10th Company fight like veterans and the 1st reinforce them with scouts, that was what would be done. If a mission required their devastators to operate in scattered fire teams instead of neat squads, then neatness would be sacrificed. They did not break the Codex out of spite or pride. They bent it in the same way they bent everything else, toward the single goal of killing the foe and surviving to do it again. Marines raised in that culture came to certain conclusions as naturally as breathing. Glory was a distraction. Monuments were for the dead, and dead men did not win wars. Survival was a weapon, a multiplier that meant the lessons of one campaign. could be carried into the next instead of buried under marble. There was no such thing as a fair fight with Xenos or traitor. To offer one was to indulge in vanity, to ambush, to sabotage, to starve, to terrify, to whisper heresy in the right ear and make enemies turn on one another before the first bolter was fired. These were just different calibers of ammunition. In that blood-stinking, warp-haunted time after the heresy, whenever an Imperial commander looked at a map riddled with red glyphs and saw one infestation, one raiding fleet, one alien foothold too small for a full crusade, but too dangerous to ignore, the same question came up. Who can deal with this quietly? The answer, more and more often, was the same. A fleet-based chapter without a fortress to tie it down. A cadre of shadow-bred killers who wanted neither thanks nor witnesses. A line in an order of battle that simply read, Raptors deployed. The rest of the record was empty, save for the word resolved. The planet had no name that mattered. Once, in the first flush of its fortification, some dutiful scribe in the Segmentum Command had assigned it a designation of letters and digits, a neat tag to hang on a lump of rock at the edge of reality. The Raptors never used it. For them, it was simply the world, their world, a sphere of iron-rich stone and black seas that turned slowly beneath the warped glare of the Eye of Terror, a sentinel perched on the lip of an open wound in the fabric of the galaxy. From orbit, the view was a study in contrasts. On one horizon, the warp storm reared like a frozen tsunami of colorless fire, its currents folding and unfolding in ways that made mortal eyes water and minds ache. On the other, the hard stars of the Imperium burned in thin ranks, their light cold and remote. Between those two infinities, the Raptors had carved bastions into mountain ranges and anchored void docks above the night side, their ships hanging like patient predators above the atmosphere. The fortress monastery clung to a range of jagged peaks where the air was thin and harsh. Its walls were slabs of dark adamantium and stonecrete, its weapon housings sunk deep into rock, its gun decks aimed unblinking toward the roiling madness of the eye. There were no decorative spires, no soaring statues. The architecture was brutalist and spare, built to withstand not centuries but ages, to survive not only bombardment, but the gnawing teeth of the warp storms. Down in the valleys, human settlements huddled close to the fortress's shadow. Mine heads, refineries, hab blocks grown like tumors out of older structures. These were the places that supplied the gene seed tithe with recruits, their populations living every day with the knowledge that they perched on the very brink of hell. Children grew up seeing the eyes smear across the sky on nights when the clouds parted, a static bruise that no dawn ever fully erased. They learned early what it meant when the sirens wailed. The world was a forward bastion, not a sanctuary. Patrols went up the gravity well and out into the void in a constant rhythm, strike cruisers and escorts sliding along set routes that brushed the edges of the storm and crossed the unpredictable paths of raider fleets and warp-spawned incursions. Other chapters might speak of garrison duty as a quiet assignment. For the Raptors, home was just another front line, one that never truly went quiet. In the fortress's training cages, initiates fought under the distant rumble of point defense batteries, engaging yet another incoming threat. On the firing ranges, scouts adjusted their aim as the tremors of distant impacts shook loose dust from the rafters. In the recruitment habs, men too young to yet be candidates grew up hearing that sometimes patrols did not return, that sometimes even Astartes did not come back out of the dark. Chaos Raiders tested the system's defenses with small, savage strikes, trying to find a weakness in the net. The Raptors met them in boarding actions under emergency lumens and in ambushes laid in asteroid belts and dead orbital lanes, driving them back with methodical, unsentimental violence. Xenos incursions, drawn to the warp's turbulence like scavengers to carrion, flickered in and out of reality at the system's edge. Minor orc warbands, hive fleet's smallest tendrils, strange corroded craft from nameless species, all of them had to be identified, probed, and, when necessary, exterminated before they could become something larger. This constant low-level war shaped the chapter as surely as their gene seed did. Recruits drawn from the world's hard-bitten population were already familiar with fear when they first knelt in the Apothecarian, but they were also intimately familiar with endurance. They knew that sometimes the alarms meant a brief exchange of fire in the upper atmosphere, and sometimes they meant that everything they knew could be dragged, screaming into the warp. They learned early that you did not count on help. You manned your assigned post, and you lasted as long as you could. For the Raptors, this world on the edge of the eye was the perfect forge. It reminded them every day that the enemy was not distant. It was right there, a smeared, impossible horizon that flickered and snarled above them every time they raised their eyes to the sky. Sometime in the slow grind of the Imperium's Middle Ages, in those millennia that would later be numbered in the middle 30s by Terran chronologers, the storm moved. The Eye of Terror was never a static thing. It bulged and contracted, its tides influenced by events that only demons and madmen truly understood. Abaddon the Despoiler, heir to the War Master's treachery, began to test the Imperium's borders with Black Crusades, hurling fleets and warbands and entire demon worlds out of the Eye in vast, hateful arcs. One of those early crusades broke across the region where the Raptor's world hung its watch. The details are lost in the smoke of time and in the more literal smoke of burned archives. There are fragmentary logs, half-melted data cores, conflicting accounts passed down in chapter halls far from that region. Some speak of a fleet action gone wrong, of traitor capital ships punching through a screen of loyalist vessels and turning their guns on the planet below. Others hint at cult uprisings in the recruitment habs, of a long-seeded infection blooming at the worst possible moment, turning anti-orbital defenses inward. What is recorded in the dry, uncaring script of the Administratum is simple. Homeworld destroyed. Chapter status lost in action, presumed destroyed. Somewhere between one Black Crusade and the next, between one set of frantic sector-wide defense orders and the inevitable writs of regret sent to those few High Lords who still pretended to track such things, the Raptors vanished from the ledgers. Their world, on the eye's edge, was listed as dead, its surface scoured, its population scattered or consumed. Their fortress monastery, that brutal range of defenses and vaults, was marked as ruined. A chapter that had spent its existence watching the abyss was swallowed by it. For the Imperium, which had long since grown used to treating lives and even entire worlds as numbers to be added and erased on tablets, it was another ugly line in a ledger already black with losses. For the Raptors themselves, for those who lived through whatever hell hit their home, it was something else. There are rumors, of course. There always are. A rogue trader's log, recovered centuries later from a derelict found drifting near a warp shoal, speaks of a green armored strike force boarding his ship without warning, executing a band of chaos champions in his holds, and then leaving without explanation. A fragment of picked capture from a beleaguered shrine world in the same general region shows what might be Raptors. Iconography on the shoulders of a kill team moving through shellfire, covering an evacuation that no one had expected. There are half-believed stories among voidfarers of a lone strike cruiser with its transponder stripped, hull scarred and patch welded, appearing out of unstable warp translation points, just long enough to savage the flanks of raider fleets before burning away again into the storm. Men talk of kill markings carved into its armor that track not worlds saved, but worlds denied to the enemy through scorched earth campaigns. The official line remained unchanged. The Raptors were gone. Their tithe obligations were struck from the records. Their gene seed stocks were written off. Their name, once engraved on the long lists of active chapters, was carefully chiseled over and replaced with a notation that boiled down, in essence, to do not expect them. Institutional death has a weight all its own. A chapter is more than its marines. It is its fortress, its forges, its relics, and its shrines. It is the pattern of its rituals, the names of its fallen carved into stone and steel, the slow accumulation of trophies and histories that turn a fighting force into a legend. When the Raptors' world on the eye's edge burned, all of that was lost or scattered. There were no reliquaries for pilgrims to visit, no great halls where veterans could stand beneath banners that had seen so many campaigns and feel the presence of those who had held them before. There was ash. There was the bare possibility that somewhere, somehow, pockets of brothers had refused to die. A chapter written off as dead does not receive relief forces. Reinforcement requests go unanswered when the administratum believes the requesting parties to be ghosts. Supplies that might once have been diverted toward rebuilding are directed elsewhere, to chapters whose survival is not in question. The machine of imperial war cannot afford to grieve. It moves on. For any Raptors who survived the annihilation of their home, the message was clear enough, even without words. No one is coming. In a galaxy where even their own fortress monastery could be destroyed, and their very existence penciled out of reality with the lazy scrape of a scribe's stylus, the Raptors' already hard-edged obsession with survival calcified into doctrine. Lives had always been a resource to be spent carefully, now that care took on a sharper edge. Every Marine preserved was a small act of defiance against the universe's eagerness to erase them. They doubled down on every habit that had ever kept them alive. Engagements that could be avoided were. Battles that could be reshaped into ambushes were twisted into those forms, even if the process offended the sensibilities of Allied commanders. Casualties were not badges of honor to be flaunted in proud remembrances. They were failures to be examined in cold detail, so that the same mistake would not be repeated when there was no world left to hide on and no fortress to retreat to. In this, the Raptors were not entirely alone. The long losing wars of the Middle Imperium produced other casualties that refused to lie down. Phantom chapters, the strategos began to call them. Forces declared destroyed, whose heraldry would later appear in some distant war, worn by grim-faced warriors who did not comment on the administrative discrepancy. Sometimes these were truly fragments, rogue remnants cut off from home that had grown inward, feral with isolation. Sometimes they were full chapters whose eradication had been prematurely recorded, either through error or through malice. The Raptors became one of the most infamous of these echoes. Centuries after their presumed death, their sigil flickered back into reliable Imperial awareness during the brutal campaigns of the Caberiad cluster, where they fought against Chaos and Xenos raiders with the same unadorned efficiency they always had. Their presence in the later Badab conflict, operating as patrol escorts and hunter-killers against secessionist forces, while other chapters took center stage, confirmed that they were very much alive, their numbers replenished from sources they did not care to share. They had found a new fortress monastery by then, or built one, a place known simply as Prime. It was less a replacement for their lost world than an instrument, a tool from which to wage war, rather than a shrine to what had come before. There were no wide-open plazas for parades. There were firing ranges and data vaults and orbital docks. The scars of their erasure ran too deep for them to ever again mistake a stack of stone on a planet's surface for permanence. Their silence in the archives had never meant that nothing was happening. It had meant that whatever they were doing did not require, or perhaps did not merit, official notice. They had been killing in the dark for as long as they had existed. Being declared dead simply made it easier to move without questions. An enemy whose destruction was not recorded still bled and died when a bolt round found his heart. A Xenos colony whose orbital tissue had been quietly infected with sabotage charges still burned just as brightly when its atmosphere was set alight. Somewhere, on the edge of some other storm, a man would look up and see nothing, hear nothing, sense nothing of what stalked him. There would be no Imperial Auspex sweep that noted the Raptors' passage, no triumphant entries in campaign logs giving them credit, only the results, a quiet shift in the pattern of raids, a sudden silence where once there had been distress calls, a gap in the line of an encroaching Xenos empire, as if something had reached out of the dark and simply plucked entire warbands away. For the Imperium at large, it was easy to believe that when a name dropped out of the records, it belonged to the dead. For the Raptors, absence was just another kind of camouflage. The storms closed behind them like a great rotten flower. On the Auspex, they were patterns of radiation and gravitic shear, tidal surges of unreality, blooming along the long spine of the Sancta Angelus cluster. On the bridge deck of the strike cruiser that bore the Raptor's sigil, there were a black wall on the main view screen, star fields vanishing one by one as warp interference devoured the light. In more superstitious navies, men would have talked of gods and omens. In the fleet of the Adeptus Astartes, there was only data and the sharp crack of orders. Warp routes into the region had always been unreliable. The northwestern reaches of the galaxy were where the Imperium's grip loosened and the storms gnawed at reality like teeth. It was precisely why the Raptors had been sent there. A string of industrial worlds, agri-moons and mining stations, lashed together by unstable warp lanes and old trade corridors, had started to suffer Orc raids. At first they were the usual irritants, pirates and freebooters, hitching rides on the backwash of convoys. Then the raids grew larger, coherent. Something ugly was coalescing in the dark. A task force had been assembled, a battle barge, several strike cruisers, a small flotilla of escorts, enough to cull whatever nest of greenskins had taken root and remind the sector that it still belonged to the Imperium of Man. They translated in. Then the warp turned, and the Imperium vanished behind them. It took time for the reality to settle in, even among minds as hardened as Astartes. At first it was an inconvenience. Astropaths reported interference, but they always did. Messages went out along the usual routes, wrapped in wards and codes, bearing sigils of urgency. No reply returned. Warp charts grew steadily more red. Routes marked marginal before were quietly reclassified as impossible. The storms swelled. Hololithic maps of the segmentum around Sancta Angelus began to look like a nest of barbed wire, all safe paths cut. Vox intercepts that once, carried the background hum of Imperial traffic, faded to static, then to silence. The Raptors found themselves alone in a pocket of normal space that was normal only by comparison with the madness howling just beyond its borders. The Orcs did not waste the opportunity. They were already there, gathering, their ramshackle fleets converging on the cluster like flies on carrion. What had been scattered bands of raiders and mercenary warbands began to align around a single gravitational point in the primitive psychic field the greenskins dragged with them wherever they went. A war boss of unusual low cunning and brutal charisma had staked his claim. Iron Goal. It was not a name that would ever appear in Imperial Tactica centuries later, not unless followed by a brief note that he had been killed in some forgotten theater. Orcs lived and died too fast and too noisily for their leaders to leave neat marks in other species' histories. But in that trapped cluster, for those 30 standard years, Iron Goal was the axis on which a growing Wah turned. He took scores of worlds in that time. Some he smashed in days, his mobs pouring from crude landers to overrun half-prepared PDF before the Raptors could even close. Others he simply infested, turning moons into gun platforms, strip-mining planets into forge piles that belched out vehicles and ammunition in a constant clanking tide. Dozens of tribes answered his call, drawn by the psychic stink of imminent violence. Each victory, each hard-fought slaughter, added another layer of momentum to the storm front of green. In the void, orc hulks lurked among the wreckage of old fleets and abandoned station rings. Their crude engines and jury-rigged weapons made all the more dangerous by their sheer number. Convoys that tried to flee the cluster were hunted down and torn apart. Astropathic messages that might have carried word of the catastrophe back to the wider Imperium were drowned in the crackling shriek of the warp. Raptors took the measure of this rising empire and understood two things. They were outnumbered beyond any reasonable ratio, and no one was coming to help. Some chapters would have made defiant speeches then, invoked the Emperor's name, and vowed to die to the last man holding some symbolic line. The Raptors looked at charts, at ammunition stocks, at fuel levels and gene seed reserves, and began to cut themselves into smaller pieces. Entire companies dissolved into roving kill teams. Some remained shipborne, their strike cruisers and escorts going to minimum crew, hanging in free drift among debris fields or behind moons, while their boarding pods and teleport beacons became the teeth of a harassment campaign. Others went dirt side, dropping onto worlds that Iron Goal's mobs had already claimed or were in the process of claiming, disappearing into underhive ruins, mountain ranges, jungle canopies, and ash wastes. They shifted fully into guerrilla war, not as an expedient, but as a way of life. In the orc forges, grot riggers and mech boys toiled to the beat of gunfire and the slap of chains. They turned mountains into slag heaps and slag heaps into ammunition, hurling shells and crude armor plates down the line in an endless clatter. The Raptors bled those installations, not with frontal assaults, but with 1,000 cuts. Sabotage teams crept in under cover of orc celebrations, planting charges in coolant systems and munition stores. Snipers learned the shapes of mech silhouettes and picked them off from impossible distances, knowing that killing the right few mines could cost the enemy more war machines than any barrage. The orcs loved spectacle, noise, flash. They fired their guns into the air when there was nothing to shoot. They raced their trucks for the joy of crashing. They crammed their docks with crude banners and trophies. The Raptors turned that love against them. They let one depot fall quiet while another burned brighter, knowing that the mobs would surge toward the most obvious fight. They seeded false icons, rival clan markings, and insulting glyphs in the right places to spark intra-tribal feuds that pulled whole warbands off the main fronts and into private bloodbaths. On some worlds, the Raptors acted as ghosts in the ruins, appearing in the middle of orc encampments in the small hours when even greenskins grew sluggish, killing bosses and hard lads, then vanishing before the mobs could fully rouse. On others, they played a longer game, allowing certain strongholds to remain just intact enough to keep drawing in more orcs, fattening the target before finally collapsing it in a controlled implosion of orbital bombardment and ground assault. All of it cost them. Armor was battered and rarely fully restored. Ceramite plates cracked and were patched with whatever was to hand, leaving some Marines in a mottled patchwork of decades-old campaigns and hurried field repairs. The chapter's stores of sacred unguents and sanctified oils ran low, and tech Marines rationed them out with a stinginess that verged on cruelty. Relics disappeared into mud and ash. A banner that had once hung in the fortress on the eye's edge was used to wrap explosives against an ammunition dump because there was no other cloth at hand that would not melt under the heat. Brothers died where there were no apothecaries to collect their gene seed in time. Some fell holding choke points in tunnels that would later be collapsed, their bodies buried under tons of rock and ferrocrete, names recorded in data cores that might never see the light of a chapter hall. Others were dragged down by sheer weight of orc flesh, their broken bodies trampled in victory parades that stank of fungus and black powder. The Raptors buried what remains they could in unmarked pits on nameless moons, a bolter shell placed atop each mound as both marker and promise. They kept careful tallies of their dead, not for mourning but for accounting. Each life spent was weighed against what it had bought. This outpost destroyed. That convoy sent spiraling into a gravity well. This warband redirected. That forge silenced. 30 years of that kind of living would have broken lesser men. For Astartes, whose lifespans stretched across centuries, it was still a long time to fight without a pause, without even the illusory safety of a fortress to return to. Whatever interest the Raptors had ever had in honor duels or pageantry was stripped away entirely in those decades. Honor was a word for chapters that had reserves. Sancta Angelus taught the Raptors to hate with a focus that had nothing to do with pride. Every orc became, in their eyes, the same thing. Biomass around a gun and a crude engine, a set of muscles and instincts that could be turned or severed. They learned the shapes of orc thought well enough to predict reactions almost by reflex. How long until a mob broke if its knobs were killed in a certain pattern? How close a war boss would allow a rival to get before killing him? Where an orc thought to stand to best see a spectacle, and thus where to place a mine. They did not hate the greenskins because of any ancient feud. They hated them because 30 years of seeing the same brutal stupidity grinding landscapes to pulp burned the image of that destruction into their minds more deeply than any catechism. It could not go on forever. No war does. The choice is only ever who ends it, and at what cost. In the 30th year, the patterns the Raptors had been mapping and pushing finally brought them to the center. Warboss Irongold had grown complacent, as all orc leaders eventually did, when their wah swelled large enough to blot out the sky. He rode to war in a gargantuan machine that was part battle fortress, part walking idol, trailed by 100-strong bodyguard in crude mega armor and a swarm of lesser mobs. He had made a showpiece of his power, as was his nature. The fortress engine blazed with stolen, imperial icons welded sideways, with glyphs painted in blood and oil, with trophy racks of conquered banners and the skulls of enemies. It strode across one of the core worlds of the cluster, stamping cities into rubble, its coming heralded by a roar that shook Habstacks apart. The Raptors let it come. They had chosen the battlefield with paranoid care. A region of half-collapsed hive spires and manufactoria, where the ground was undermined by old transit tunnels, and the remaining infrastructure was just sturdy enough to bear the weight of Irongold's monstrosity for a little while. They had seeded the approaches with traps that would not stop the engine, but would shape its path, nudging it into the kill box as surely as if they had a hand on the controls. When it was committed, when the war boss and his bodyguard were as far from reinforcement as they were going to get, the Raptors struck. They came from below, from side tunnels and service shafts that the orcs had not even noticed. Melter bombs and crack charges hung like wasp nests in sewer arches and drain culverts, timed to blow the instant the fortress's feet churned above them. The first detonations staggered the machine, throwing mobs from the ramps and balconies that clung to its flanks. The second wave tore out stabilizers and ammo hoppers, turning parts of its own armament inward in sudden, catastrophic discharges. Raptors' kill teams swarmed up from the holes those blasts tore, maglocks biting into scorched metal, bolters barking in short, controlled bursts. The greenskins howled and surged to meet them, choppers and claws rising and falling in a mad frenzy. But for all their brute strength and numbers, they were clumsy in the tight confines of their own war idol. The fight dragged on for 6 hours, measured by the chronometers in the Raptors' gauntlets. Close quarters, no room to maneuver, armor clashing in smoke that stank of promethium and fungus blood. Marines fought until their auto-senses were clogged with soot, and their blades were notched and red. Orcs died in heaps, bodies piling in corridors and on gantries. the sheer crush sometimes making it difficult even to swing a weapon. At the heart of it, in an arena like a desecrated shrine, they found Irongol. He was everything a war boss needed to be. Massive, armored in plates stolen from tanks and fortifications, his body studded with crude bionics and trophies. His claw could shear ceramite. His shooter roared like a heavy stubber, firing bursts wild enough to kill his own lads in the crush. He laughed when he saw the Astartes, a sound like rocks grinding together, eager for the fight. The Raptors did not oblige him with a duel worthy of Saga. They killed his banner first, bolter round stitching through the glyph bearers and sending his proud totem crashing down into the muck. They shot out his eyeslits. They tore the floor from under him with charges. When he fell, they buried him under fire from every angle, treating him as the gravest threat on the field, not because of his personal prowess, but because of the effect his death would have on the psychic gestalt of the Wah. When the war boss finally stopped moving, when even the orcs nearest to him realized that their boss was not getting back up, the whole warp-loaded pressure of the orc presence in the cluster shuddered. Out on the flanks, mobs that had been roaring mindlessly a heartbeat before faltered. Slugger fire went ragged. Arguments broke out mid-charge that turned into fights. Knobs eyed each other with hungry calculation. Within days, Sancta Angelus was no longer the stage of a coherent wah. It was a feeding frenzy. Would-be war bosses rose and fell so fast that some never even managed to spread their names beyond a single valley before a rival took their head and their hat. Warbands turned on each other over booty, over insults, over nothing at all, because the psychic pressure that had forced them into a single tide had broken. Worlds that had once echoed with the single, unified chant of Irongol's armies became a patchwork of smaller wars, each ugly, but each far less dangerous in strategic terms. The Raptors counted that as victory. They did not remain to savor it. Their fleet, such as it was, those ships that had survived 3 decades of unsupported operations, pulled back along the old patrol routes. They rode the edge of the storms, watching for any flicker of thinning warp tides that might allow them to slip out of the cluster. They did not hang around to plant banners over conquered capitals or to carve memorials into the rock. Finishing the job, in the sense most chapters used the phrase, would have meant years more of grinding down the scattered orc tribes until nothing remained but stragglers. It would also have meant burning through the last of their own lives and munitions to do work that the orcs could, and would, do for them out of sheer murderous instinct. Instead, they vanished into the storms as quietly as the warp would allow, letting the greenskins tear at each other in their wake. When the Imperium finally threaded ships back into the Sancta Angelus cluster, navigating by charts that had warped and twisted under the storm's pressure, they did not find a unified alien empire. They found wrecked war machines, shattered fortresses, worlds whose surfaces were crisscrossed with trenches and mass graves and crude orc idols knocked over and defaced by other orcs. They found human populations traumatized but alive, clinging to survival in pockets of ruin. In some places, they found signs that someone had known how to shoot. Old firing positions, cut into rock and ferrocrete, spent shells of bolt caliber half buried in the soil, their brass turned green with age. The remains of camo netting, rotted away to threads. In a few ruins, they found orc graffiti that spoke, in their brutish way, of ghosts that had killed from the dark. Sancta Angelus is not a famous campaign in the grand histories. It sits in the footnotes, if at all, a minor theatre in a time when the Imperium was fighting on too many fronts to keep track. But for the Raptors, it is a line carved deep into their collective memory. It proved, beyond dispute, that they could operate indefinitely behind enemy lines against a Xenos race built for nothing but war, that they could break a war, not by meeting it head-on, but by poisoning the mind that held it together, and that they could do it while keeping their own losses within limits that a cold soul might almost call acceptable. Centuries later, orc spores would still sprout on some of those worlds, giving rise to new mobs that would have no memory of Irongold's banner. They would brawl over old ruins and fight new enemies, and perhaps, in the churned earth of some forgotten hill, a boot would kick free a corroded casing once spat from a raptor's bolter, a relic with no story attached, mute and anonymous. Fossils of a war, where the prey never truly grasped how thoroughly it had been hunted. Endicon 9 had forgotten its own name. In the old records, it had been a proud hive world, a pillar of industry on the ragged flank of the segmentum, its spires clawing at a sky choked with refinery smoke and the exhaust of shuttle traffic. A place of endless labor and unremarkable loyalty, the sort of world that existed to be tithed and bled and never celebrated. Then the Aeldari had come, and for almost 80 standard years, the hives had been nothing more than a feeding trough. They called it the Crucible, the Corsair Princes, and their darker kin. A fine word, smooth and elegant, for what was in truth little more than a slaughterhouse. Webway gates flared to life in the ruined plazas and manufactoria guts, spilling out sleek armored figures in colors that hurt mortal eyes. They took the governors first, then the arbites, then the officers of the local regiments. They cut the heads from the world's defenses in a handful of nights and watched the body twitch for years thereafter. The human population did not die. Death would have been mercy. Instead, they were forced to strip their own hive layers for wealth. Great caravans of ore and refined alloys, stacks of archaeotech, convoys of chemical vats and promethium drums, all marched at knife point to zones where the fabric of reality itself screamed as the Corsairs opened passages into that unnatural dimension that linked their stolen domains. Sometimes, when the gates yawned wider and the air turned thin and sour with the scent of other suns, darker shapes came through. Drukhari raiding parties, their armor barbed and their movements like the glide of scalpels. They took their pick of the population for torments best not described, and left the rest with the knowledge that they might be chosen next time. For nearly 80 years it went on. The hives became hollowed carcasses, their outer spires lit by alien witchlight, their underhives packed with penned humanity, breeding stock and slave labor and victims. The Corsairs named the place the Crucible because it was where they refined misery into profit. When the Imperium finally pushed a liberation fleet into that region, it did not do so out of compassion. It did so because the loss of Endicon's output had begun to bite in supply calculations, and because leaving a webway anchor of that size in alien hands so close to Imperial lanes offended the strategos. At the heart of the fleet were two forces that did not need to be told why they were there. The Red Scorpions came first, their ships hard-edged and immaculate, hulls bearing the livery of a chapter obsessed with purity and compliance. Their captain spoke of reclaiming a wayward world, of scourging the Xenos' taint and reasserting the writ of terror. The Raptors arrived without speeches, translating into real space in the shadow of a battered Imperial Navy escort group that had spent too long trying and failing to dislodge Aeldari raiders from nearby lanes. Their strike cruisers cut their engines to minimum as soon as they cleared the storms and slipped toward the system in a low emissions glide, like predators hugging the seabed. Space around Endicon was a graveyard. Old Navy hulls drifted in slow, tumbling arcs, their armor peeled open by lances of coherent light and pulses of energies no human vessel could match. Civilian transports lay gutted, cargo spilling into the dark in frozen cascades. Here and there, Aeldari craft flitted among the wreckage, escorts and raider hulls like shards of moonlight, their engines leaving barely a whisper on auspex. The war that followed was not the clean, ordered clash of battle lines that Imperial training picts loved to show. It was a long, bitter attrition, the sort of void campaign the Aeldari were sure they excelled at. They used their speed and grace to dart in at the flanks, cutting at exposed escorts, slicing, sensor booms and peeling away armor with contemptuous ease. Their pilots trusted in millennia, old battle instincts, and the precognition of their seers, in craft that could twist aside from macro shells as if they were standing still. The Raptors and Red Scorpions answered with stubborn, methodical brutality. Scorpion battle barges anchored their positions behind overlapping fields of fire, turning whole segments of space into kill zones where anything that flickered into reality would be met with torrents of flak and lance bolts. Navy escorts interposed themselves as ablative shields, paying for every Eldari kill with wrecked hulls and screaming crews. Raptor strike cruisers ranged wider, luring Corsair flotillas into pursuit, feigning damage and broken lines, only to drag them into the blind cones of hidden gun batteries or into mined volumes of space where proximity triggers blossomed in sudden feral beauty. For every alien ship that died, 2 more seemed to slip out of the webway. But over time, the weight of Imperial fire began to tell. Eldari captains grew more cautious, their hit-and-run strikes shorter, their withdrawals sharper. The noose tightened around Endicon's gravity well. Down on the surface, in the gas-choked canyons between hive towers, the real work began. The Red Scorpions made the first spear thrusts, dropping companies into contested plazas and manufactoria stacks, their advance as precise and uncompromising as the Codex demanded. They broke slave pens and executed collaborators, raised the Aquila over bastions that had not seen it in decades. The Raptors went where their cousins did not. They slid into the underhives and the skeletal frameworks of unfinished spires, into the dead ducts and cargo ways the Eldari rarely bothered to patrol. Their scouts disappeared among the slave populations, helms and armor traded for rags and stolen respirators. Augmetics damped down until they functioned as little more than unusually hard. Men. They were not there to inspire, they were there to map. Eldari Corsairs did not hold territory like humans. They raided it, drained it, treated it as a resource to be harvested in cycles. They struck where they pleased, when they pleased, confidence born of long impunity. The Raptors studied those cycles with the same cold attention they once turned on Orc tribal migrations. They built patterns out of screams, charted the frequency and direction of raids, traced the energy signatures that flared every time a webway breach opened in some forgotten transit vault. When enough dots connected, they started to pull on the lines between them. Slave uprisings did not happen in the Crucible by accident. They were manufactured. Raptor agents whispered the right words to men on the brink, pressed stolen blades into calloused hands, sabotaged power relays, and sent flares through sump-cracked vox sets. Whole levels erupted in sudden violence, hab blocks turning into charnel houses as desperate humans hurled themselves at thin screens of alien guardians. The Corsairs responded as they always had, dropping in with disdainful force, their armor gleaming, their weapons cutting down crowds by the score. They drove the rebels back toward choke points and plazas, just as they had done for near a century, secure in the knowledge that terror would do their work for them. The first time reality split, and a webway gate yawned open to disgorge reinforcements, Raptors were already in position. They had watched the energy build, felt the wrongness in the air as the ancient, unnatural pathways flexed. They had pre-sighted firing arcs, marked cover, placed charges. As the first Corsair stepped through, helm still turned toward the contortions of the gate. A bolt took him clean through the torso. The shot had been plotted hours ago. The squeeze of the trigger was almost an afterthought. What followed was not a battle in the sense that Imperial histories like to record. It was an execution. Every Eldari who emerged from that breach did so into overlapping fields of fire, into mines triggered not by crude pressure plates, but by the shift of mass and energy that their own entry patterns created. Raptors moved through the smoke like iron specters, closing to blades only when necessary, leaving bodies in careful piles that clogged retreat paths and turned elegant advances into flailing routes. The surviving humans in that uprising did not understand what had saved them. Many died anyway as collateral in the killing grounds. Those who lived were herded, with blunt efficiency, into zones the Raptors deemed strategically useful for future operations. There was no kindness in it. There was utility. For the Eldari, humans were chattel, aesthetic choices at best. They were raw material for pleasure, for sacrifice, for commerce. The Corsairs and the Drukhari made little distinction between a slave driven to collapse under a load of ore and one strapped to a slab, in a flare-lit chamber somewhere deep in the webway. Pain was currency either way. For the Raptors, humans were assets. They were extra hands to carry ammunition. They were bait to pull a raid in a desired direction. They were a form of camouflage, an organic screen behind which Astartes could move unseen. The difference was not mercy, merely mathematics. A human might find themselves freed from an Eldari pen by a bolt round through their overseer's skull, only to be ordered at gunpoint into a corridor that would, inevitably, draw Drukhari skirmishers into a prepared crossfire. The only mercy either side offered was that one death might be quicker, cleaner than the other. There was a story told later among the chapter's scout sergeants about a single marksman on Endicon. He crawled through fog-choked fields beyond one of the hive's broken agri domes, his camo cloak soaked and heavy, his armor caked with grime. Somewhere ahead of him, Drukhari raiders moved, their forms barely visible in the grey, more absence than presence, their weaponry designed to carve flesh and spirit in ways that made the worst orc brutality look almost honest. They thought themselves the hunters. They always did. The Raptor watched them through his scope for long, patient minutes, marking their routes, the way they favored certain bits of rubble, the way their leader lingered to savor the fear of the captives they drove before them. He did not feel hatred in any personal sense. Hatred was too hot. What he felt was a tight, cold focus, a line drawn between his barrel and the point where that leader's helm would pass through his sights. When the shot came, it was inevitable. The first Drukhari died without even the grace of understanding that the prey had turned. The second fell trying to whirl toward a muzzle flash that was already gone. By the time the survivors realized they were being killed from beyond the range of their senses, the engagement was half over. It was a small thing in the scale of the crucible. A patrol cut down, a slave column scattered. But it was also the purest distillation of what the Raptors brought to Endicon. Patience, discipline, the ability to turn the enemy's confidence into a fault line and drive a bolt right through it. Against Eldari speed and arrogance, their doctrine seemed almost sluggish. Corsairs wanted wars of moments, quick strikes and faster withdrawals, victory measured in how much they could hurt before anyone could answer. The Raptors refused to play that game. They slowed everything down. Escape routes were mapped and then methodically cut. Webway anchors were identified and sabotaged, so that a gate that opened wide and clean one day would open ragged and unstable the next, vomiting its reinforcements into the wrong place at the wrong time. Kill zones were constructed not just in space and in plazas, but in time. A corridor that was safe on the third raid became a death trap on the fourth, because that was when the Raptors had calculated the enemy would be most confident. They let the Corsairs build habits, then killed them for having those habits. Endicon was liberated in the end. That is the word the High Lords used, and the chapel scribes. The alien fleets were broken or driven off, the webway breaches sealed as best mortal hands could manage, the hives reclaimed in the Emperor's name. The cost was carved into steel. Navy escorts died in dozens, their hulls torn apart as they interposed themselves between Eldari lances and the more valuable Astartes ships. Transport vessels loaded with guard reinforcements and evacuees vanished into sudden flares of tortured warp light, as they tried to cross a region of space that the Corsairs had seeded with snares no human mind had ever considered. Hive spires collapsed under bombardment or sabotage, whole layers of habitation crushed into strata of crushed plasteel and bone. The population that survived did so with eyes haunted by both sets of masters. They had traded one kind of slavery for another. The Eldari had treated them as cattle, to be bled and worked and discarded. The Imperium treated them as a resource to be reutilized. Regiments were raised from the broken survivors and sent off to fight in other wars before the ash had stopped falling in their home streets. For the Raptors, Endicon was another lesson layered on top of old ones. They did not walk away, speaking of tragic, inscrutable aliens. There was no room for that kind of romanticism in their ledgers. Eldari Corsairs and their Drukhari kin were predators, nothing more. They wore beauty like an affectation over very simple appetites. They needed to be exterminated, methodically, over as many campaigns as it took, because anything less invited repetition. Later, when the galaxy broke again and the Great Rift split reality, Raptor's elements would be assigned ahead of Indomitus Crusade fleets pushing along the fringes of that impossible wound. They hunted Corsair bands there in the half-light, void-born ghosts stalking other ghosts, ambush set against ambush in a cold war of patience and cruelty. Eldari captains who once had considered themselves uncatchable found their navigation routes predicted, their private way stations compromised, their favorite prey worlds suddenly bristling with invisible teeth. Some died in the void, their elegant craft blossoming silently as torpedoes and boarding pods found them. Others died on nameless moons, a single bolt taking them through the helm from so far away that the sound of the shot never reached their ears. For an Eldari raider, the nightmare was never a glorious final duel atop a spire or amid burning wreckage, blades sparking and oaths traded in ancient tongues. The nightmare was walking onto a world they had owned for generations, confidence heavy as perfume in their lungs, and then feeling, for the first time, the cold knowledge that somewhere out there, in the smoke and the dark, a pair of unseen lenses had settled on them, and that the next breath they took might be their last. Taros was not a world anyone loved. It was a ball of rock and sand on the rim of the eastern fringe, a mining world whose only real virtue was the wealth buried beneath its deserts. Under the sun's pale glare, the surface baked and cracked, its few settlements huddled around water sources and refinery stacks. For generations it had served the Imperium without complaint, shipping promethium and minerals along dust-choked trade routes to feed distant wars. Then the governor sold it, not cleanly, not in a single treacherous act that could be marked and punished. It was a slow, quiet surrender, trade agreements, technology exchanged for output quotas, the silent arrival of watercast envoys, and the gentle pressure of Tau propaganda, promising a greater good in which Taros would be more than just another cog in an uncaring machine. By the time the administratum noticed that tithes had become irregular and augurs reported unfamiliar ships in Taros orbit, the world was already gone in all the ways that mattered. The planetary defense forces had been quietly purged and rebuilt with human collaborators. The old missile silos and defense grids had been taken over by Earth-cast engineers and turned toward new purposes. The population, such as it was, had grown used to seeing blue armor and the stooped silhouettes of Kroot mercenaries on their streets. When the Imperium finally decided to reclaim Taros, it did so in the only way it understood. It assembled an army and sent it to make the mistake right with blood. On the bridge of the battle barge War Talon, the desert world was a slowly turning disk of yellow and brown on the main display. Icons representing troop convoys and navy escorts hung around it in a neat, hopeful formation. Vox traffic muttered and crackled between vessels, litanies overlaying orders, astropathic confirmations of embarkations and timetables. In the strategium, hololithic projections showed a more honest picture. The Tau had dug in. They had fortified old Imperial positions and built new ones. They had deployed battlesuits and artillery, sensor nets and drone screens. They had brought in Kroot, carnivore kindreds, to serve as skirmishers and scouts. They had folded Taros into their empire with efficiency and without fuss. The Imperium believed brute force would be enough to pry it back out. The Raptors knew better even before the first drop pod burned through the upper atmosphere. They came in with the vanguard, strike forces from the chapter's 3rd and 6th companies, garrisoned aboard War Talon, and a handful of escorts. Their initial mission was simple on paper and murderous in reality. A single planetary defense missile complex, codenamed Decima, sat in a position where it could threaten the troop transports as they descended to their landing zones. Built by the Imperium in earlier days, it had been taken over by the Tau and integrated into their command webs. If it remained operational, one lucky salvo could drown regiments in fire before they even set foot on the desert. Decima had to die first. War Talon raked the silo complex with a storm of bombardment shells, pulverizing surface structures and turning the surrounding sand into molten glass. Deep bunkers shrugged off the worst of it. Hardened launch tubes held firm. The Tau had improved on Imperial work, strengthening shutters and adding redundant systems. From orbit, it looked like a job done. The Raptors' commanders knew better. They dropped anyway. Thunderhawks howled down through high-altitude dust storms, hulls rattling as they bit into pressure and heat. Drop pods slammed into the bombardment craters and burst open like steel seeds, disgorging squads into choking smoke and whipping sand. The Raptors advanced in staggered lines toward the half-buried silhouettes of Decima's launch towers, moving, with the cautious, controlled aggression of hunters entering another predator's den. There was a moment of almost blessed stillness. Then the Tau responded. Markalites lanced out from hidden positions, pinpricks of cold illumination tagging Raptor squads. The first railgun rounds came in a heartbeat later, hypersonic slugs that turned rock into shards and ceramite into thunderclaps of overpressure and heat.
Be sure to subscribe. You know you want to. If you don't, you'll be sent into the void and nobody will find you for the rest of your life. So be sure to subscribe. Remember, subscribe.
Drones rose from concealed emplacements, their smooth bodies humming, sensor arrays blooming like mechanical flowers as they tried to fix firing solutions through the dust. The Raptors were no strangers to ambushes, but they had rarely faced an enemy whose first instinct was to drown the battlefield in data rather than noise. The Tau did not roar or charge. They maneuvered. Fire warrior teams repositioned with disciplined speed behind low walls and half-buried bunkers, pulse rifles steady, lines of fire overlapping. Battlesuits lifted into the air on plumes of contragrav, jetting from cover to cover, firing and then vanishing behind smoke and distance. It was a war of long-range fire and movement, a duel between stealth and sensors. Raptor squads that tried to advance in traditional formations saw their armor ring and spark as invisible beams painted them for volleys. They adapted quickly. Helms adjusted to pick out the faint signatures of marker light beams. Experienced sergeants developed a feel for the rhythm of drone sweeps and Tau firing cycles, timing their movements to slip between pulses. Snipers picked out pathfinders and spotters, turning Tau coordination into a stuttering, less precise thing. They reached Decima's heart in the end, not through a triumphant assault, but through a series of ugly, piecemeal infiltrations. Teams cut their way through ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels, closing with defenders in cramped spaces, where the sleek lines of pulse carbines and the bulk of battlesuit limbs became liabilities. Charges were set on fire control systems, on ammunition vaults, on the delicate machinery that allowed the missiles to speak to the sky. When the silo finally died, vomited flame and toxic smoke into Taros's air, and sank part of itself into a crater of its own making, the troop convoys above moved in, the wider campaign began. For a time, the Raptors fought the kind of war they had trained for. They ranged ahead of Imperial armored columns and infantry regiments, spearheading assaults, tearing holes in Tau defensive nets for guard units to flood through. They worked in conjunction with Cadian armored regiments, striking at flanks while Leman Russ squadrons hammered the front. The Tau, recognizing a threat they could not casually swat aside, diverted resources to tracking and avoiding the green armored Astartes spearheads. But the enemy was faster. Tau cadres refused to stand and be broken where the Imperium wanted them to. They yielded ground when it was advantageous, pulling back to prepared positions that extended the length of their supply lines but shortened their lines of fire. Their aircraft owned the high skies. Barracudas and other sleek warplanes cut Imperial flyers apart and harried convoys, forcing the invaders to crawl forward beneath sheets of blue fire. Kroot ambushes in canyons shredded columns that were already stretched thin by heat and distance. Human collaborators sowed misinformation, directed artillery onto their supposed allies, sabotaged fuel dumps. Every kilometer cost blood and materiel. Every slight Imperial gain was paid for twice over. The Raptors adapted as best they could. They traded Baroque battlefield honor for whatever kept their brothers alive. They used captured drones against their makers, rigging them as explosive decoys or as mobile distractions. They learned the telltale whine of battlesuit jets, the way Tau commanders like to position themselves on rises with clear lines of sight. They struck at command nodes, ammunition stores, airfields. They killed ethereals when they could, knowing that such deaths rippled through Tau forces like silent shockwaves. It was not enough. Taros did not fall back into Imperial hands. The campaign ground itself down into a long, bitter retreat as logistics failed and casualties mounted. The Tau did not defeat the Imperium in a single decisive blow. They bled it until the cost of pushing forward became unacceptable even to the most fanatic of commissars. When the order finally came to withdraw, it was not couched in uplifting rhetoric. It was a simple acknowledgement that further losses would gain nothing. The Raptors were given their last task: rear guard. They knew what that meant. It meant holding blocking positions while the guard pulled back to landing zones. It meant buying time with lives. It meant standing in firing arcs deliberately while transports burned for orbit, knowing that any brother who did not make it to the extraction point would be left in the sand. On the approaches to the main evacuation sites, they dug in. They turned half-finished fortifications and wrecked armor into makeshift bastions. Devastator squads set up overlapping fire lanes, heavy bolters and missile launchers sighted with the kind of precision only decades of war could provide. Tactical squads entrenched themselves in shallow trenches and behind dunes, camo cloaks flapping in the furnace wind. Tau forces pressed in, their own losses having taught them caution but not mercy. Railgun rounds gouged trenches into the sand and tore chunks from Prometheum tanks, igniting gouts of burning fuel. Battlesuits advanced in bounding leaps, firing from behind plumes of dust. Kroot pack leaders drove their kindreds forward, hoping to overwhelm positions with sheer feral momentum. The Raptors did what they had always done. They killed, methodically. They fell back by squads, by fire teams, never in a panic, always in a pattern that drew the enemy into plotted fields of fire. They took hits that would have pulped lesser warriors and fought on until armor failed and limbs gave way. Apothecaries moved along the lines like grim specters, administering combat stims, pulling back those whose gene seed could be saved, leaving the rest to do what they could with the moments left to them. Captain Cades of the 6th Company directed one such line, his helm off so he could see the flow of the battlefield with unfiltered eyes, his voice steady over the vox as he assigned kill zones and withdrawal timings. When the Tau strikes found him, it was not with a dramatic single blow, but with spray after spray of molten shrapnel flensing across his right side as a rail round detonated a fuel cache too close to his position. He fell, armor fused and smoking, flesh charred beneath. He lived long enough to see that his orders were still being carried out, that the line was holding, that the transports were lifting clear. Later, much later, he would wake entombed in the sarcophagus of a dreadnought, a living relic of a war that had not been won. Not all his men were so fortunate. Squads traded their own lives to keep routes open. Some units disappeared entirely. Last Vox transmissions cut off mid-sentence as Tau ordnance finally saturated their positions. Others limped back to the landing zones with half their original numbers, armor blackened, icons scored beyond recognition. They boarded Thunderhawks under fire, desert sand whipping around them, heat haze turning the horizon into a shimmering blur in which it was easy to imagine the next wave of Xenos shapes. The fleet pulled away. Taros remained in Tau hands. The mining installations continued to run under alien management. The collaborators who had not died in the fighting were folded into the Guevesa auxiliaries, their loyalty bought with clean water, stable rations, and the illusion of purpose. The Imperium, nursing its losses, filed its reports, reassigned units, and looked elsewhere for easier targets. The Raptors remembered. Veterans of the campaign carried Taros in the set of their shoulders and the coldness of their eyes when Tau were mentioned. The young Empire, with its smooth technology and its talk of unity, had humiliated Imperial forces in open war. It had matched the Raptors in methodical thought and surpassed many of their allies in the intelligent application of firepower. For a chapter that prided itself on practical efficiency, that was an insult that could not be allowed to stand. The Tau represented more than a battlefield threat to them. They were a rival way of war, efficient, data-driven, utilitarian. They fought not for gods or for ancient grudges, but for a principle that pretended to be rational. They measured kill ratios and supply projections. They adjusted doctrines in response to failures. In a warped way, they were what the Imperium might have been if it had not entombed itself in dogma and ritual. The Raptors looked into that mirror and resolved to break it one shard at a time. In the years that followed, small Raptor strike forces appeared again and again along the eastern fringe. Sometimes their presence was recorded in Navy dispatches and guard after-action reports. More often, it was inferred from the pattern of destruction. A Tau command post annihilated in a night raid, its drones and monitors silenced before they could sound the alarm. An airbase reduced to a field of twisted metal and blackened craters, its aircraft smashed on the ground by charges placed in fuel lines and munition stacks. A series of seemingly unconnected accidents in a supply chain that, when taken together, added up to starvation in a forward operating enclave. Tau commanders learned to hate the Raptors in turn. They were difficult to predict, harder to pin down, and infuriatingly unwilling to engage on terms that suited their careful doctrines. They struck from angles that Auspex and drone grids had marked. As secure, slipped through scanner nets that should have been airtight, turned the reassuring hum of data into a lie. For all their calm, for all their air of reason, the Raptors were every bit as fanatical as any crusading zealot. They simply expressed that fanaticism through operational planning instead of shouted sermons. To them, negotiation with Xenos was not compromise, it was contamination. The Tau's soft-voiced envoys and patient arguments did not impress. They enraged because they endangered. The Raptors did not argue philosophy, they shot messengers. On one fringe world after another, the same scene played out in variations. A Tau command bunker, half buried in stone and sand, lit by the glow of holographic displays and status icons. Earthcast technicians monitoring power flows and shield integrity. Firecast officers tracing lines on tactical maps, moving marker symbols to indicate patrols and suspected enemy positions. Somewhere in a recessed chamber, an ethereal sat in calm contemplation offering a few well-chosen words now and then to guide and reassure. Outside, the night. Sensors swept in overlapping cones, drones circling, motion detectors humming. On auspex and screen, the perimeter seemed secure. If anomalies flickered here and there, they were dismissed as thermal ghosts, as interference from local geology, as known faults. 100 meters away, a single Raptor lay in a shallow depression, armor covered in dust and rock fragments. His heart beat slow. His breath was measured. Data fed into his helm from his squad mates as they moved into position, each one a quiet wait in the dark. He watched the shifting heat signatures of the bunker, the movement of sentries, the spin of drones. He did not need to hate the ethereal inside to do his job. Hate was a waste of focus. What drove his finger as it tightened on the trigger was the same arithmetic that had guided his chapter since the Scouring. That alien with its soft voice and its patient eyes had decided that Taros and a score of other worlds would be better under a sky painted with Tau symbols than under the double-headed eagle. It had fed men to pulse fire and crute teeth in the name of a principle that brooked no disagreement. It had helped build an empire whose continued existence meant more imperial dead. A single bolt took it through the head when the time came, the round punching through armor and bone and the fragile organs beneath. The ethereal's body slumped without dignity, its death a quiet, almost unremarkable event inside the bunker. Outside, Raptors moved, exploiting the fracture in command and morale, blowing doors, cutting down officers and technicians, planting charges where they would do the most damage. When they left, the bunker burned, not out of vengeance, not even out of anger, because in the hard sums that the Raptors kept, one more node in the Tau's web had been removed, and that meant, somewhere down the line, a few more human lives might not be spent quite so cheaply. Prime did not look like a place where legends were made. From orbit, it was another hard rock in the northern reaches of Segmentum Solar, its surface a scabbed grey, broken by cold oceans and ranges of mountains like old scar tissue. Clouds dragged slow shadows over barren plains. There were no cathedral spires gleaming in the thin light, no pilgrim processions winding up holy roads. The only structures that mattered were sunk into the bones of the planet, their outlines barely visible unless you knew what to look for. The fortress monastery was not a monument. It was a tool. Gun batteries were buried in the rock, their muzzles hidden behind retractable shutters that, when closed, looked like nothing more than faults in the stone. Landing pads were recessed, their lights dark unless a vessel was on approach. The outer walls, where there were walls at all, were slabs of adamantium and stonecrete without ornamentation, broken only by firing slits and sensor housings. Inside, the corridors were wide enough for armored giants and narrow enough to be held by a handful of them against whatever dared breach the outer ring. Within those walls, the Raptors shaped themselves for the wars that would come. On paper, their organization would have pleased any devotee of the Primarch of Ultramar. 10 companies, each with its own command cadre, its own complement of officers and specialists, its own motor pool and armory allocations. 1st Company veterans, 2nd through 5th as battle companies, 6th and 7th as reserves, 8th and 9th as assault and devastator specialists, 10th as the Scout Company, Librarius, Reclusium, Armory, Apothecarian. The bones of the Codex Astartes were all there. In practice, those bones flexed. Campaign rosters on Prime's Tactica walls were a mess to any mind that insisted on tidy lines. Squads were detached and recombined according to experience and aptitude, rather than rigid company boundaries. Battle brothers wore markings that might, at first glance, contradict one another, honors for actions undertaken, while seconded to other forces layered over their home company sigils. Command of a given operation might fall to a captain whose formal position suggested he should be nowhere near that theatre, because the Raptors valued familiarity with the enemy and terrain more than they did the neat hierarchy of seniority. The Codex was not scripture here. It was a manual, and manuals could be amended. In the training halls, this philosophy was drilled into initiates from the moment they could stand in power armor without falling. Exercises were never simple recreations of parade ground tactics. They were labyrinthine scenarios with incomplete information, shifting objectives, and simulated losses that forced squad leaders to improvise or fail. A sergeant might find half his squad's armor systems suddenly redlined by an instructor representing sensor, blindness, or ammunition depletion, and be expected to reform his plan on the instant. Raptors companies dissolved and reformed into strike forces almost as a reflex. A standard operation did not involve hundreds of Astartes advancing in a straight line. It involved 24 brothers here, 10 there, perhaps a larger reserve held where it could pounce on weakness. Small, mobile elements, each with a clear field of responsibility and wide latitude to interpret it. They relied on eyes and ears as much as they did on bolters. Scouts were not a probationary afterthought. They were the foundation. The 10th Company was large, well-resourced, and its veterans were respected not just for their eventual ascension to full battle plate, but for the years they spent crawling through mud and void ducts, learning how to see. Reconnaissance was not glamorous work. It meant lying in one position for days, for weeks, waiting for the one moment when a movement or a vox burst would make all the discomfort worth it. From those scouts came a culture of fieldcraft that permeated the chapter. Armor was painted in mottled, broken patterns. Camo cloaks were as ubiquitous as purity seals. Brothers learned how to blend into rubble, into jungle, into the fractured plascrete of urban ruins. They practiced moving without sound in full plate, adjusting their gait to the ground, learning how to shift weight so that boots disturbed gravel less. They trained to fight with vox nets jammed, forced to rely on hand signs, instinct, and pre-arranged contingency plans. Squad-level initiative was not merely tolerated, it was expected. A Raptor sergeant on the ground, watching an enemy formation through his lenses, was empowered to alter a mission's parameters if the opportunity arose. If a higher value target presented itself, if a flank exposed itself, if a building could be dropped at the right moment to crush an entire command element, he was trusted to make the call. His superiors would judge the result later, not the deviation. This flexibility extended beyond their own number. The Raptors worked with the Astra Militarum often, more often than many chapters cared to. On Prime, guard officers came and went in a steady flow, summoned to joint briefings, instructed in joint operations, debriefed in small, unforgiving rooms after campaigns where reality had not matched their expectations. The chapter's view of mortal soldiers was not sentimental. They called them screens when used to mask movement, bait when used to draw fire, force multipliers when used to hold ground that Astartes could not afford to garrison. They had few illusions about how short a guardsman's life could be when thrown into the worst of it. But unlike some of their cousins, the Raptors cared about preserving those assets. Long wars consumed bodies. A campaign fought over decades against a Xenos empire, or a chaos incursion, could not be sustained on Astartes alone. Human regiments were the bulk of the meat that held the line, that soaked up the attrition while the Raptors did the cutting work at the joints. Wasting them through poor planning was not just callous, it was stupid. Raptor officers coordinated evac timings with guard commanders, insisted on reconnaissance before assaults that other chapters might have considered straightforward, and sometimes vetoed proposed offensives outright if they judged the projected casualties too high for what would be gained. They did not do it out of pity. They did it because each guardsman preserved today might be another rifle in a trench 10 campaigns later. Prime sat at the nexus of all these considerations, a fortress and a logistics node, a training ground and a war room. Its location near the northern approaches of Segmentum Solar made it an ideal jumping-off point for campaigns against Orc empires gnawing at the flanks of Imperial space, against Drukhari raiders slipping out of the webway to slash at convoys, against Chaos fleets probing from the depths of the eye's wider eddies. It was a cold place, even by the standards of Astartes. There were no civilian settlements on the surface outside the fortress' immediate support structures. Recruits were drawn from hard holdfasts and void-born communities that had lived under the shadow of alien predation and warp anomalies for generations. They arrived on Prime with the understanding that the world they were seeing was not a holy sight. It was a weapon. At the center of that weapon, in chambers that were almost ascetic in their lack of decoration, sat Lias Issodon. He did not cut the figure that Imperial propaganda preferred for a chapter master. There were no flowing robes, no halo of purity seals, no ostentatious artificer armor dripping with relics. His plate was worn and well maintained, its green overpainted with fresh patches of disruptive pattern when a campaign demanded it. He was as often seen in a ghillie cloak on a firing range as he was at the head of a council table. The epithet that clung to him, even within the chapter, was simple: the Grim. He spoke rarely, and when he did, with a flatness that stripped drama from his words. He listened more than he talked, eyes tracking across reports, maps, and pict feeds with the practiced ease of a mind that had spent centuries juggling variables. As a marksman, he was said to be able to place a shot through a target's visor at distances where most Astartes would not trust their optics, adjusting for wind, gravity, and the subtle vibrations of his own armor without conscious thought. As a strategist, he thought in layers. An operation was never just the immediate engagement. It was the supply routes feeding it, the morale of the troops on both sides, the likely reactions of enemy command, the tertiary effects on nearby systems. His preferred methods were as unshowy as his appearance. An Issodon operation began long before the first shot. Reconnaissance, human and augur-based, built a picture of the enemy's logistics webs, their leadership hierarchies, their doctrine. Saboteurs were seeded into positions where they could damage industrial output without being immediately detected. Vox traffic was monitored, then altered. False orders were inserted. Convoys were redirected. Small anomalies appeared in the enemy's routines, each one minor on its own, together slowly twisting the pattern of their movements. When the killing started, it did so on multiple levels. An ammunition dump went up just as a counterattack was being prepared. A secondary headquarters lost its commander to a single, inexplicable sniper shot at the moment when clarification of orders might have saved a flank. A seemingly secure rear area discovered that its supply of combat stimulants had been corrupted weeks before, leaving elite troops sluggish and sickly at the critical hour. By the time the main Raptor forces engaged, their foes were already bleeding from a dozen unseen cuts. Issodon did not care if anyone ever knew how many of those cuts were his doing. In the Badab conflict, when half a dozen chapters and as many lesser forces tore a sector apart over secession and loyalty, the Raptors did not stand in the front rank of history's paintings. Their sigil did not dominate the campaign's stained glass recreations in far-off shrine worlds. They operated in the background, as patrol and escort forces, hunting the raiders and ambushers that the secessionist astral claws and their allies sent to harry Imperial shipping. Issodon could have pressed for greater prominence. As a chapter master of long experience, he might have contended for overall strategic command. Instead, he ceded that role without argument to Karab Kullan of the Red Scorpions, a commander whose chapter's reputation for rigid adherence to imperial edicts made him a more acceptable figurehead to the High Lords. Issodon's concern was not whose name would be attached to the inevitable histories. It was that the enemy's ability to strike from the shadows be removed. Raptors' fleets patrolled the trade lanes and narrow warp passages of the Badab sector, intercepting secessionist vessels, forcing them into engagements away from their chosen ambush points, escorting vital convoys through fire and Auspex ghosts alike. They were the solution to the problem that never makes for grand statues, not the glorious siege. The question of how to keep the flow of munitions and food moving, while Astartes fought Astartes. Such humility in the face of pride was alien to many chapters. To the Raptors, it was simply another expression of their creed. Ego got in the way of clean kills. Even in matters of the warp, this practicality held. Their librarians did not stride into battle as blazing avatars crowned in witchfire, throwing bolts of raw immaterium like spears. The Librarius on Prime was a quiet wing of the fortress, its halls lined with wards and the faint hum of containment fields. Psychers were recruited carefully, tested relentlessly, trained to channel their gifts not into spectacle, but into amplification. On operations, a Raptor librarian might sit at the heart of a kill team, helm sealed, eyes closed, senses extended beyond the material. He would reach along the threads of probability, nudging his brother's instincts toward the right turning, the right moment to fire, the right wall to go through. He would wrap the squad in a pall of obfuscation, not invisibility in the mythic sense, but a subtle distortion that caused enemy sensor sweeps to glitch, patrol routes to turn a corner too soon, Auspex pings to register as background noise. In the void, librarians sat in quiet chambers behind the bridges, feeling for the ripples that signified an emerging raider fleet or a massed corsair translation, giving Issodon and his captains the barest of warnings before solid data caught up. They were amplifiers of awareness, not banners of power. On Prime's central strategium floor, Issodon stood with his senior captains and the chief librarian, the air around them filled with hololithic projections. Worlds hung as translucent spheres, their surfaces overlaid with topographical lines and flickers of unit icons. Shipping routes wound through space in arcs, lit in different colors, some steady, some jagged and broken, where raids and storms had taken their toll. There were no sweeping arrows in bold colors, marking out glorious drives to victory. There were ratios, numbers of dead against objectives secured, estimates of enemy reinforcement capability against the projected losses necessary to cripple it. Supply lines highlighted not in triumph, but in warning, nodes blinking where a single lost freighter might starve an entire garrison. Extinction curves for Xenos empires, lines of light showing how many years, how many operations, how many bodies it would take to prune this Orc empire or that Tau Sept to a manageable stump. The captain's armor was bare of ornament, save for the practical. Additional mag clamps where equipment had to be carried. Tool rigs, range finders. Their weapons were not gilded. They were custom-tuned, optics modified, stocks and grips adapted to the preferences of their wielders. Issodon listened as reports came in, as his officers offered assessments. He nodded once here, asked for clarification there, his gaze flicking back to the maps each time. When he spoke, his orders were simple and precise. This strike force to be reinforced with an additional scout squad and an attached librarian for extended reconnaissance along the fringe of a Drakari hunting route. That company to be broken into smaller elements and dispersed along key worlds in the path of an Orc migration, cutting supply and leadership rather than trying to meet the Horde head-on. A request for honored dual deployment in an upcoming campaign against a Chaos warband denied, the captain making it told to find a way to bleed the heretics without giving them the satisfaction of a staged clash. Around them, Prime hummed, its machine spirit engaged in the 1,000 tasks necessary to sustain a chapter at war. Armorers recited Binharic prayers as they checked firing mechanisms and blessed ammunition. Apothecaries tallied gene seed reserves and calculated projected attrition. Tech Marines whispered to reactor cores and Auspex mast arrays. Above, in the cold dark beyond the atmosphere, Raptor ships drifted and waited, their hulls dark, their engines warm, ready to burn for whatever theater Issodon's maps and numbers decreed. The Grim in his ghillie cloak did not need the galaxy to know his name. It was enough that, somewhere out there, an enemy the Imperium had marked as a problem would, in time, simply stop existing. The sky broke open and never healed. Across the length of the galaxy, the cicatrix maledictum tore reality in half, a wound of raw warp that bled madness into the void. Whole. Sectors vanished behind storms. Warp routes that had been tenuous for millennia snapped all together. Worlds that had known only the slow, grinding misery of the Imperium's long decline woke to find their nights lit by a bruise of impossible colors clawing at the stars. On Prime, the Raptors watched the Stormfront crawl across the hololithic maps and understood that what had been bad was becoming worse. Their fortress monastery lay toward the northern reaches of Segmentum Solar, close enough to the roiling edge of the Great Rift that its astropaths began to bleed from the eyes during long-range projections. Vox traffic buzzed, with cut-off pleas from outlying systems. Naval dispatches came through shredded, data missing, orders half-formed. For chapters further from the maelstrom, there might have been time to debate, to seek signs and portents. For the Raptors, the message that finally cut through on a clear signal was simple. A call to muster. Roboutigillaman returned from stasis and bearing titles that sat on him like old armor refitted in haste, had taken up the role of Lord Commander. He did not waste words, at least not in the summons that reached Prime. The galaxy was burning. The Imperium was cut in two. A crusade was forming, not the triumphant exploratory drives of the Great Crusade, but a desperate thrust to plug bleeding arteries and drag as many worlds as possible back from immediate annihilation. He needed scouts. He needed infiltrators. He needed killers who knew how to move in the dark. The Raptors answered. They did not do so with the fanfare some chapters indulged in, no ritual repainting of armor in crusade livery, no great mustering parades with banners unfurled and oaths screamed to the sky. They loaded ammunition. They checked seals. They updated their charts. They assigned companies and strike forces to the segments of the crusade fleets that would best use them. Guilliman, who had spent his first life trying to impose order on a turbulent empire, understood exactly what he was asking. He requested Raptors strike contingents for not one, but three of the great crusade fleets that would spear the nightmare. Primus, Secundus, Tertius. Each of those vast armadas would need eyes and knives at its vanguard. Each would need someone to slip ahead of the lumen-bright warships and mark out paths through regions where warp storms had chewed old maps into lies. On Prime's strategium floor, Issodon and his captains accepted the assignments without drama. A portion of the first company, elements of the second and sixth, a reinforced scout contingent, and attached librarians for Fleet Primus. A similar pattern for Secundus. For Tertius, a heavier focus on void warfare specialists, brothers who knew how to kill ships as easily as they killed men. They scattered themselves between those crusades like shot from a disciplined volley. Lieutenant Serranis, who had cut his teeth in the Orc Wars of Sancta Angelus, and who had hunted Drukhari in the shadows of Endicon, found himself leading a strike force in the vanguard of Crusade Tertius as it pushed along the churning edges of the Great Rift. He was given a black slice of the star chart and a brief that would have sounded almost insultingly broad to anyone who had not worn the Raptor's badge. Hunt Corsairs. Make this lane safe. The enemy in that theater were Aeldari of the old school, piratical dynasties that had long fed off the shipping of the region. The rupture of reality had shaken even them. Their seers found their visions choked with new possibilities, their webway routes flickering. Some adapted. Some went mad. Many grew more vicious, sensing opportunity in the Imperium's distraction. The flagship of one such dynasty, a blade steeped in plunder and screams, carried a name that meant nothing in Gothic and less in any human ledger. The Eldari called it Valanith, a vessel that had slipped between the stars since before the first stone of the imperial palace had been laid. Its hull was a sweep of antique curves and jagged fins, its engines purring with entropic energies that had never known a Mechanicus blessing. Saranis made it his problem. For 3 standard months, he chased it along the rift's fringes, never directly, never in the obvious way. The Valanith was not some blunt orc hulk. It did not linger after strikes. It flickered in and out of real space on its own timetable, raiding here, feinting there, always pulling back before anyone could get a firm fix on its patterns. The Raptors did what they always did. They watched, they listened. Every world the Corsairs struck at left traces, wounded astropaths, babbling shards of precognition. Survivors who remembered snatches of color and symbol. Anomalies in energy readings where webway breaches flared and died. Saranis' scouts and librarians sifted those fragments, laid them atop one another like layers of thin vellum until a picture, imperfect but functional, emerged. The Valanith favored certain angles of approach. It preferred worlds with particular kinds of infrastructure. Its master had a taste for certain patterns of cruelty that, while inscrutable in motive, were predictable in execution. The strike force mapped those tendencies, extrapolated, then laid their own trap in the half-lit void between systems. When the Corsair flagship dropped into real space to harvest another helpless root station, it found instead a volume of space seeded with silent Raptors ships, engines already warm, guns already tracking. Torpedoes knifed out, some real, some decoys, confusing the alien vessel's augurs. Boarding pods followed, their courses plotted not toward the obvious points of ingress, but toward maintenance shafts and subliminal energy leaks the librarians had identified as structural vulnerabilities. Saranis led the main boarding party. He went in not at the head of a roaring assault squad, but as one more armored shape. Among many, his armor dulled, his heraldry muted. Inside the Valanith, the air tasted wrong, thin and perfumed with the ghosts of 1,000 stolen atmospheres. The architecture was a nightmare of graceful curves and sudden drops, designed for forms more fluid than human. The Raptors moved through it with methodical violence, smashing aside opposition, planting charges at junctions, cutting out life support nodes. They headed not for the ostentatious throne chambers and trophy halls, but for the pulsing heart of the ship's command systems. When they finally found the Corsair Lord, he was surrounded by artifacts that would have driven mortal men mad, his armor a museum piece of older wars. He raised his weapons. He began to speak, words curving out of his tongue like poison. Saranis shot him in the face. Later, in Crusade records, the action would be given a few lines. Flagship neutralized. Corsair activity in region significantly reduced. Strike force casualties within acceptable parameters. It was one more nameless entry in an endless book of such kills. The Indomitus crusade ground on. As the Raptors bled for Guilliman's desperate push, a new element entered their halls. Primaris reinforcements, taller and broader, bearing gene seed refined by lost arts, disembarked on prime and on forward staging posts with the wary confidence of warriors who had trained for wars they were only now seeing. They brought improved organs, redundant systems, a slightly different cadence to their movements. The Raptors did not treat them as miracles. They treated them as men in need of paint and doctrine. Primaris brothers were given camo cloaks and told to get them dirty. They were issued rifles and blades and told to go lie in the mud until they understood that their extra organs would not save them from stupidity. They learned the same contempt for spectacle, the same reverence for survival as a tool. Those who had expected to stride into war as shining exemplars found themselves crawling through sump channels and void crawl spaces, measuring their worth in the quality of the kills they made unseen. Some of them died learning, most adapted. The Raptors were good at teaching. In the 42nd millennium, to be hunted by the Raptors was to feel a particular kind of dread. If you were an orc war boss on the leading edge of a growing wah, you might start to notice that your lieutenants were not as numerous as they once were. Knobs who strutted too close to the edges of battlefields, too eager to watch the fighting, began to fall to shots that came from no obvious source. Weird boys went madder than usual and never came back. Ammo dumps exploded just after key mobs had moved away, killing only the right number to sour morale without providing the guilty joy of a good blast. You would bellow and blame and kill some of your own, as was your nature, but the losses would continue. Your empire would begin to limp, not topple, and you would never quite understand why the red ones and the blue ones and the ones with skulls on their banners named your sector as ripe for culling. If you were a Tau commander, used to seeing the world as patterns on a display, you would watch your sensor nets blink and stutter. Drones that had been reliable began to show blind patches. Recon data routes were compromised. Pathfinders reported strange interference. You scheduled maintenance. You updated software. You blamed Earthcast colleagues. Still, just before the most important operations, your feeds would go dark in precisely the wrong places. Then the explosions would come. Not random destruction, but targeted strikes. A munitions depot here, a forward airfield there. Not enough to cripple you outright, just enough to strip away your advantages and force you into fights on terms you did not choose. Somewhere, an ethereal's absence would ripple through your forces, making casualty projections skew grim. If you were Drukhari, used to being the monster in the dark, you might simply not come back. A raiding force would leave Comora in a flurry of blades and narcotic vapors, slipping through the webway, emerging on some fat, helpless world on the rift's edge. The raid would begin as usual, screams and slave-taking, a carnival of refined cruelty. Then, without warning, something would be wrong. Not dramatic, not at first. A transport portal that failed to open, a splinter cannon that misfired because someone had tampered with its feed, a squad leader whose helm shattered under a single, unimaginably well-placed shot. By the time the survivors reached for retreat, the exits would be compromised. The webway anchors would have been seeded with explosives or spatial distortions. Instead of a clean step back into the nightmare city, raiders would find themselves stranded, cut off, stalked by shapes that did not hurry and did not taunt. Their screams would never reach Comora. As far as their kin were concerned, they simply vanished. There is, among some corners of the Imperium, a tendency to speak of the Raptors as reasonable Marines. The phrase is usually uttered with a mixture of relief and faint contempt. Here, at last, are Astartes, who do not throw guardsmen into grinder assaults for the sake of a holy phrase. Here are warriors who understand logistics, who glance at casualty projections and alter plans accordingly. Here is a chapter that does not scream about honor every other breath. The implication is that this makes them kinder, gentler, more humane. That line of thought rarely survives contact with their results. The Raptors do not waste lives, but they spend them. They do not stage glorious last stands, but they design campaigns where populations are bled with careful precision, where entire biomes are poisoned to deny Xenos food sources, where cities are turned into death mazes that will still be killing intruders long after any surviving humans have been evacuated or conscripted. When other chapters burn a world in a day with cyclonic torpedoes and call that holy wrath, the Raptors might take a decade to achieve the same end by twisting supply, assassinating leaders, and encouraging predators. The death toll is not lower. It is simply slower, more deliberate, less operatic. They are reasonable only in that they accept the logic of the age they live in, an age of ruin, an age that grew out of the Scouring, that long grinding aftermath of the heresy when the Imperium realized that it would not recover, not truly, and began to teach itself how to endure instead. The commentators of that age learned to speak in terms of necessary atrocities. They wrote of forced relocations and exterminations and compliance actions in dry, detached prose, as if the words could insulate them from the screams. The Raptors are a product of that same long defeat. They learned early that heroism is often just the story you tell yourself so you can sleep, after ordering another massacre. Within the wider brotherhood of the Adeptus Astartes, their legacy is a quiet, contentious thing. Some chapters regard them with suspicion. Their lack of pomp reads, to more knightly orders, as a lack of proper reverence. Their willingness to work in shadows, to use mortals as bait, to bend the Codex's prescriptions, smells of compromise and, in some eyes, of approaching heresy. There are those who would rather die on a wall under a banner than win a war the way the Raptors do. Others understand. In the reclusium vaults of more grounded chapters, in the private councils away from the sight of serfs and scribes, there are captains and masters who speak of the Raptors with respect. Professionals, they say. Men who know what must be done and do it without preening. Men you want on your flank when the enemy is not an honor duelist, but a Xenos swarm or a chaos fleet that will not break for theatrics. They are not beloved. They do not need to be. In the grim darkness of the far future, the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not rage, however apocalyptic. It is not zeal, however incandescent. Rage burns out. Zeal can be turned or misdirected. The Raptors embody a simpler, more terrifying truth. Cold, methodical competence, pointed squarely at anything not human. They do not hate in the way a preacher hates. Their hatred is not a fire to warm themselves at. It is a vector, a set of instructions. Identify threat. Determine the most efficient way to extinguish it. Apply pressure until nothing is left but ashes and records. Somewhere, on a world whose name no imperial clerk will ever bother to engrave into a ledger, an alien force marches through the night. Their boots crunch on frost or ash or hardened dust. Their breath fogs in the air or is filtered through masks that reek of unfamiliar biospheres. They think themselves alone. Sensors report nothing out of place. Patrols cycle. Comms chatter is low and routine. Above, the stars are smeared by the invisible turbulence of the rift, but they are still there, pinpricks of light in a sky that has not yet been swallowed. On a ridge overlooking their route, half buried in rock and scrub, a line of figures lies still. Green armor, dulled and patched, camo cloaks stiff with cold and mud. Bolters and longer-barreled rifles rested on improvised mounts, their optics already dialed in. Helm lenses dimmed to avoid betraying a glint. Vox nets murmuring with the slow, measured cadences of men who have been watching this path for days, waiting for exactly this moment. There are no speeches, no litanies, no shouted names. There is the faint click of a trigger discipline rune as it turns from safe to ready. By the time the sun rises over that forgotten world, the aliens will be dead or dying. Their command shattered, their supplies burning, their attempts at retreat cut off and fed into kill zones. The Raptors will already be moving away, picking their routes. Toward the next problem, the Imperium needs to stop existing. No statues will be carved, no songs will be sung. The only proof that they were ever there will be the corpses, the empty cartridges, and the sudden, inexplicable absence of a threat that, the day before, believed itself safe.